He had received a soldier's training through 19 years in camp. He had disciplined his body to hardship, his appetite to moderation, his tongue to silence, his thought to objectivity. He could run or ride with the swiftest, hunt or fight with the bravest. He was the first to enter the battle, and the last to leave the field. Will Durant, describing Hannibal Barca in his book, Caesar and Christ. Hello and welcome to the Western Traditions Podcast. My name is Rob Paxton, and this is the 16th episode of the Roman Empire, a series of podcasts about Roman history. In the last episode, we looked at the events which occurred between the First and Second Punic Wars. Carthage recovered from her losses and reorganized her empire. Meanwhile, her greatest general, Hamilcar Barca, took his son Hannibal and an army of mercenaries to Spain to expand Carthaginian control there and to plot against Rome. Rome, meanwhile, incorporated the island of Sicily into her growing realm and continued to expand her frontiers elsewhere, usually by means of warfare. Now, as we proceed, a reminder about pronunciation. I have mentioned before that, for the most part, I typically use English pronunciation for many ancient names. Thus, Marcius Claudius Marcellus becomes Marcus Claudius Marcellus. In the same way, we have become used to repeating Julius Caesar's famous adage, Beni, Bidi, Bici, I came, I saw, I conquered. But truly, in classical Latin, those words would have been pronounced Veni, Vidi, Vici. I know it's hard to believe, but those are the ways that classical Latin was pronounced. So you will have to forgive me if I frequently use the less accurate but more commonly accepted pronunciation of names as we move forward. A few other things about words and histories and so on in the upcoming podcast episode. I frequently refer to Spain in this episode, and in other episodes I refer to Africa as well. It's important to understand what we mean. In this time period, there was no Spain. There was the Iberian Peninsula, which was full of, at this time, mostly Celtic tribes. However, for the sake of modern understanding of geography and so that someone has an idea of where I'm speaking about, I will often say Spain, although I do occasionally say Iberia. And when I refer to Africa, I do not mean the entire continent. I'm referring mostly to the area that we think of today as Tunisia and maybe a little bit of Libya and Algeria, because that is the name that the Romans applied to that region in the time period. Finally, a little bit about the muddiness of the historical annals that are used as sources here. The ancient histories, those compiled by Livy, by Polybius, and others, they often disagree on many details, and often we're not really sure about things regarding the timelines of all these events. So ultimately, every historian, and this writer that is speaking now to you, has to come up with a sort of compelling drama, a fiction of sorts that they write as they put together all these different historical opinions about what quote-unquote really happened. So consider that as you read along. You may find in other sources different viewpoints on what I'm about to tell you. This is simply me taking artistic license with all of the material that I have read. Now, with that caveat about the contents of today's podcast out of the way, let us look back in time to 219 BC, when the fragile peace between Rome and Carthage was upset, as fragile treaties often are, when one side makes a new alliance that does not sit well with the other. We typically mark the Roman treaty with Saguntum in eastern Spain in 219 BC as the cause of the Second Punic War. However, we might also assign blame for the outbreak of conflict on the death of Hasdrubal, Hamilcar Barca's son-in-law and the uncle of Hannibal Barca, the same Hannibal who would terrorize Rome for many years to come. Not that Rome had anything to do with Hasdrubal's death. In fact, Rome was probably quite content with Hasdrubal's focus on affairs in southern Spain, well outside the sphere of Roman interest. As later Roman history would show, the West was always a sideshow for the Roman Senate when compared to the opportunities in the East. Even in the late Empire, the most precious possessions of Rome were in the East, as indeed they moved their capital eastward toward Constantinople. This was where wealth had been amassing for thousands of years under the pharaohs in Egypt and the various kings in Mesopotamia and Anatolia and Persia. Now, a little bit of a digression here. This is really something to think about. Think about just how long it took for the places that we typically think of as composing the quote-unquote West, just how long it took for these areas to become developed, to become the centers of wealth and sophistication. Not only did it not happen overnight, it took thousands of years for the financial and cultural tables to turn. We think now of the Middle East as a poor place, except with regard to their riches in petroleum, but that is a very new way to see the East. Even just a few centuries ago, the West was a backwater compared to the Eastern realms overseen by the Ottoman Turks and the Persians in terms of riches and art and history. When we study Roman history at this time period then, over 2,000 years ago, even Rome understands itself that it is in the hinterlands of civilization. Rome and Carthage were two big fish in a small pond. And it is only this perspective, narrowed by the limits of the environment in which they struggle, that makes the conflict seem so eventful. At the same time, in the East, great wars are taking place, immense edifices are being built, great men are espousing new religions and philosophies. But we will hear very little about these things now because we are studying our Western traditions. By force, we must focus our eyes on this back alley knife fight that we call the Second Punic War, because it is in this comparatively humble endeavor in which our present global supremacy finds its origins. Getting back to the conflict, no, Rome probably had nothing to do with Hasdrubal's demise. In the course of that Carthaginian commander's efforts at expanding power in the southern Iberian Peninsula, he had come into conflict with a Celtic peoples known as the Olcades. The vast majority of people living in Iberia, the present-day location of Spain and Portugal, were Celts, descended from the same Indo-European migration into Europe, which had brought the Latins and the Greeks into their own lands thousands of years before. Far to the north, along the northern coasts of modern-day Spain, descendants of the much earlier Anatolian farmer expansion, as well as descendants of the original hunter-gatherers of Europe, lived on in isolation. Today, we call those people the Basques. Anyway, during his conflict with the Olcades in 222 BC, the Celtic king Tagus was killed. A river in Spain today still bears his name. The following year, one of this king's slaves, in a scenario which is not clearly described in any existing histories, he assassinated Hasdrubal in his own home, in revenge, apparently, for the death of his master and king. Whatever the circumstances, shortly after Hasdrubal's death, the army would allow no one but Hannibal, the son of Hannibal Barca, to be their general. The council in Carthage, increasingly sidelined by the force of the popularity of the Barca family, had little to say in the matter. Hannibal, just 26 years old, was now a great Carthaginian lord, with a massive, well-trained army at his disposal. At his father's side, when he was just a 9-year-old boy, Hannibal had stood before a shrine of Baal Haman, the king of Carthage's pantheon of gods, and he had sworn an eternal blood oath against Rome. And now, surely, the ghosts of his slain father and uncle must have whispered vengeful thoughts in his ear. All his life, Hannibal had studied Alexander the Great. There is every reason to believe that he wanted to be another Alexander. And he was not the only general who wanted to achieve such glory. Centuries later, Julius Caesar would cry when he reached his early 30s and thought of how much Alexander the Great had accomplished by that age. But Hannibal needed more than a big army, a vendetta, and an ancestral rage in order to bring war on the Romans. After a few years of brutal work subjugating more Celtic tribes in Iberia, he got that little something more that he needed. In 219 BC, the Romans concluded a treaty with Saguntum, a city which survives today by the name of Sagunto in eastern Spain. Now, Saguntum was an independent city, not subject to Hannibal, not a possession of Carthage, but it was, and no one can reasonably deny this, it was in Carthage's sphere of interest, and quite far from any territory controlled by Rome. Indeed, Rome was still heavily involved in the centuries-long struggle to wrest complete control of northern Italy from the Gauls. Between them and Saguntum were, by any measure, several hundred miles and scores of distinct cultures and tribes. Yes, Rome did have an important ally in Massilia, which is in its modern-day Marseille, in southern Gaul, but that did not come anywhere near bringing Saguntum into Rome's quote-unquote sphere of interest. But let us also be clear about the way that the Treaty of Ebro, which I mentioned in the last episode, it would be mistaken to construe that quote-unquote treaty as any sort of recognition of Carthaginian territory. In 226 BC, facing down a certain invasion by the furious Gauls, the nervous Romans had received an agreement from Hasdrubal that his forces would not cross the Ebro, the river Ebro. The Romans had eagerly accepted this accord because they feared Carthaginian support of the Gauls. But to call that agreement a treaty is to perhaps glorify a mass of meaningless paperwork. The so-called treaty did not recognize Carthaginian interests, nor did it limit Rome's. It simply stated that Carthage would not cross the Ebro. And Carthage had not done this, but they had allied with tribes near Saguntum, a city which, by the way, was on Carthage's side of that river, the river Ebro, many miles to the south of it, in fact. So Carthage naturally came into conflict with Saguntum, a town which had nothing to do with Rome and lay far away from that capital. So the true motives behind Rome's alliance with Saguntum remain a mysterious matter. Even today, after thousands of years of research and puzzling about the matter, why would Rome, which was so busy on other fronts as it was and getting more and more involved in Greece, a distraction which we will discuss in a future episode, why would Rome spit in the face of Carthage through this action and provoke a conflict that it did not really have the resources to easily manage? Consensus seems to be that it was not done out of any sort of imperialistic goal. Hindsight is 2020, and it is easy from our perspective, since this war would lead to a serious expansion of Roman size and power, it's easy to connect the dots now and say, oh, of course, Rome provoked the Carthaginians on purpose in order to bring on war and achieve empire. But historians tend to agree that this is not the motive. Indeed, both Rome and Carthage itself, not Hannibal and his army, but the ruling aristocracy of Carthage, both Rome and the Carthaginian aristocracy probably saw the coming conflict completely differently than Hannibal saw it. After all, the Roman Senate had been very cautious about taking Sardinia many years before, refusing to do so as long as Carthage was the undisputed ruler of the island, and only taking over after Carthage had lost control. So when the threatened city of Saguntum sent an embassy to Rome requesting an alliance in face of the Carthaginian threat, why would Rome accept when the Senate must surely have known of the dangerous implications and complications that would come with such an alliance? In the end, Rome probably saw all of this as merely a muscle flex. They would show Carthage and the world that they were not afraid. They would also possibly slow down or undermine Carthaginian progress in the peninsula, which, after all, was not that far away from already existing allies like Massilia in southern Gaul. And any conflict that resulted would likely remain isolated in Spain in their minds. Conveniently, it would give their consuls another place to earn experience in war, safely distant from Rome and unlikely to bring consequences to the capital. The Senate had no respect for the Carthaginian military, so they expected to lose very few soldiers in combat, and the war would ultimately cost nothing, because at the end, they would just inflict another financial penalty on the Carthaginians, who had demonstrated their weakness already by agreeing to decades of payments to Rome in order to avoid battle. Plus, they would have an opportunity to kill Hannibal on the field of battle and bring an end to the threat which the Barcid dynasty presented. It is important to remember that both sides, Rome and Carthage, had their own internal divisions as well, divisions which, in a possible oversimplification of the matter, could be identified as pro-war and anti-war. In Carthage, the Barcid party, that dynasty that started with Hamilcar and had continued on to Hannibal, this faction or party wanted war with Rome. Another party, though, wished to focus on expanding the Carthaginian realms in Africa and on keeping the peace with Rome. Rome was similarly divided with regard to aggression toward Carthage. However, neither Carthage nor Rome was truly anti-war. It was just the idea of global or large-scale war which turned off some members of each government. Now, once the war started, Carthage would also see a critical division in its perspectives. Hannibal, from the very beginning, wanted to defeat Rome in the field, invade Italy, disintegrate the League of Allies which supported it, regain Sicily and Sardinia, and make Rome beg. The aristocratic council in Carthage, however, was more than happy for Hannibal to attack Rome and weaken it, while possibly getting himself killed. Even a failed effort on Hannibal's part would buy Carthage more time and space in Spain, while getting rid of a troublemaker. This disparity between Hannibal's goals and his government's goals in the long run would possibly be the only factor which prevented him from defeating Rome. Nevertheless, as Caesar would come to say centuries later, the die was cast. The rulers of the city of Saguntum, seeing no other way to stop the Carthaginian juggernaut in Iberia, threw themselves upon the mercy of the Romans, and the city came officially within the Roman fold. And in this, bold Hannibal saw his opportunity. The Romans were finally within reach of his vengeance. His real plan, which never came to fruition, was this: to attack and seize Saguntum, which would cause the Romans to arrive later with an army. He would destroy this army, so far from its home, critically weaken the Romans and demoralize her allies. Then he would march north over the Pyrenees and then east to Italy, razing the countryside, gathering Gallic allies, and invade Italy itself. Just arriving with such an army would separate many allies from Rome's league, and an actual siege and sacking of Rome would actually be possible. But he didn't need to actually sack the city. Just the ability to do it would bring Rome to the table, to negotiate a peace that would restore Carthage to her former glory and elevate Hannibal among the greatest heroes of history. It would not work out this way, but in some respect, Hannibal would get his wish. Like his hero Alexander, he would never be forgotten, and the Romans would be talking about him for centuries. There is some doubt about how Hannibal began his march against Saguntum, thus sparking the fire of the war that was to come. Sometime in late 220 or early 219 BC, Roman envoys came to New Carthage, Hannibal's local capital in Spain, to ask him just what his intentions were with regard to the town, since the Saguntians had sent to Rome for help. Hannibal made it clear that he was going to do what was best for the people in Spain, including the people of Saguntum. Already he was using the language of the liberator, which he would continue to do in the coming years when he invaded Italy. This is the kind of language that we continue to hear in the modern age when so-called liberators take over foreign nations, quote, for the sake of the people living in them, unquote. While the Roman ambassadors went on to Carthage in Africa to further investigate Carthaginian intentions, Hannibal also sent a missive to his leadership there. But what was he asking, if anything? And were they his leaders? It is hard to say just how much power and autonomy Hannibal had at this point. He certainly wasn't a dictator over the entirety of Carthage or anything. The Shofetes and the council in Carthage certainly still controlled the empire in terms of day-to-day matters, finances, and so on. But where did Hannibal fit into the power structure? He certainly seems to have had de facto supremacy in matters regarding Spain and the army. After all, when the war truly gets underway, we'll see him shift troops around freely between Spain and Africa without asking anyone, to suit his purposes and to keep Carthage safe. So it might be tempting to say that he was sort of like a Roman dictator, temporarily elected and given supreme power over military matters. But there seems to have been no temporal limit on his power. At the same time, while we will see that he is undoubtedly the army chief, the council in Carthage will practically forget about him once he heads off to war and do a pretty lackluster job of supplying him while he is on the march for 12 or 13 years. Regardless, in the spring of 219 BC, Hannibal set off with a mostly mercenary task force to besiege Saguntum. The timing was excellent and probably no accident. Just then, the Romans had become embroiled in another Greek conflict, which I will elaborate on in a coming episode. Polybius tells us that Hannibal spent 8 months besieging the town, eventually breaching the walls and taking it by force. Hannibal would typically be much quicker about these matters later in the war, that is, the taking of a city, so he may have been taking his time on purpose, watching international matters. He initially offered to let the Saguntians leave the area with their lives, but they refused, believing that Rome would finally come to help. In the end, though, those that didn't die in the siege were captured and taken as slaves. Their land and other property became Hannibal's booty, some of which he distributed among his men, some of which he kept for his war fund, and the rest he sent back to Carthage, perhaps to give confidence to his merchant masters in the capital that this was going to be a financially beneficial endeavor. But historians do not consider the war to have begun yet. After all, no Roman army had been defeated or even engaged. As we saw with the great Greek conflicts in the Greek Sun podcast series that I did, such as the Persian War or the Peloponnesian War, the dates of conflicts and their origins are always up for debate. There are so many minor conflicts that precede the officially sanctioned dates for the beginnings of wars. There had been no official declaration of war by either party so far, but before we get to that, we should inform ourselves a little about the internal politics of Carthage and Rome. More than once in the Greek Sun, my series about ancient Greek history, I delved into the matter of how city-states were usually divided into at least two factions or parties. This should sound familiar to those of us living today, especially in 2025. These two political factions often differed significantly in terms of their leadership and the way that they thought matters, both foreign and domestic, should be handled. In Greece, the parties were typically aligned with either democratic or aristocratic goals. Occasionally, a tyrant would rise up, usually from democratic origins, but most often the cities remained in this divided state of affairs. While today some people, Americans in particular, may be shocked by the vitriol and violence presently noted between their political parties of today, this sort of violence and hatred between the parties would have been humdrum to a lot of ancient Greeks. It was not uncommon for one party to take over a city and exile or even execute members of the other party. And then those exiled factions would plot about returning, taking over, and doing the same to their political enemies. The Roman and Carthaginian nations were also divided politically. In Carthage at this time, the Barcid faction was probably the strongest. We call them the Barcid faction after Hamilcar Barca and Hannibal Barca, the father and son, about whom we've already heard so much. They desired war with Rome and overseas conquests. The Barcids were opposed by a man named Hanno and his followers. This Hanno is largely seen as responsible for failing to support the Carthaginian navy during the First Punic War. He's also the one who refused to pay the mercenaries after the war, leading to the disastrous African Civil War of which I spoke in the last episode. Hanno and his followers preferred to keep their focus on expanding the empire's African holdings and avoiding conflict with Rome. This faction was not powerful enough to keep Hannibal from marching off to war, but as we will see, they will help to hamstring Hannibal's efforts against Rome for years to come. And we already know that the Carthaginian way of handling political conflict was often bloody. It was not uncommon for an unsuccessful general to come back from war only to be crucified for his failure. In Rome, there were also factions, but they tended to treat each other, at this point in Roman history anyway, with much less personal violence. Instead, honor and public disgrace were more important factors. There were basically two factions in Rome during the Second Punic War, each with different views regarding the war, but neither was really pacifistic. As the war develops, we will see one faction a little more eager for the war and for conflict with Carthage and for direct battle with Hannibal. This faction was essentially the more democratic one, in the sense that it included many novus homos, new men, who had risen from non-aristocratic origins in Roman society and saw warfare as a means of further advancement in politics. It included men such as Marcus Minucius Rufus and Gaius Terentius Varro. The latter was a plebeian who may also have been a butcher's son, although that might just be exaggerated calumny from his aristocratic political enemies. The other faction in Rome, as I've implied already, was composed of more men of aristocratic backgrounds, such as Quintus Fabius Maximus. These men were more conservative in their views, less eager for the changes to the status quo that war with Carthage would bring, and as the war progressed, they were less likely to engage Hannibal directly in battle, preferring to wear him down rather than try to defeat him dramatically in the field. Nevertheless, as we shall see in the war's continuation, remember a couple of things about these factions. One, that Rome's factions were not that clear-cut into aristocratic and democratic. There were aristocrats and democrats on both sides. The factions were divided more by philosophies about the war. And second, these two Roman factions would almost never resort to lethal punishments, never crucify their political enemies, even when those enemies spoke out in the Senate and in vehement opposition to the war, or when generals made horrible, costly mistakes in the field versus Hannibal. I stated at the end of the last episode that I was happy that the Romans had eventually won this cultural contest thousands of years ago, and here is another facet of Roman society which fills me with that gratitude for that eventual Roman victory. As much as we might criticize some aspects of Roman law, religion, culture, etc., from our modern standpoint, they were far more humane than the Greeks, the Carthaginians, and others. Some of these Roman men that I have already mentioned will suffer great failures on the battlefield. None of them will be tortured or executed for it. Romans might shame one another, they might vilify one another publicly, but they left the violence for their actual enemies and lived with one another in comparative peace. In this, we see how the culture of the Roman Republic became so attractive over time to the peoples that they conquered. Here was a society in which one could live without fear of being hung from the nearest tree simply because you disagreed politically. A message for our own age, perhaps. The timeline of the official declaration of war is somewhat muddied, as are the motives involved. Roman historians of 2,000 years ago typically state that Hannibal started the war when he crossed the river Ebro. Thus, they laid the blame for all of it squarely on the shoulders of the Carthaginians. They had breached an official treaty by crossing the Ebro, the argument goes, and Rome was forced to respond to this threat. It seems like the Romans, though, were more likely motivated by Hannibal's capture of Saguntum, and they may have been embarrassed by their failure to come to the aid of their allies. So little focus is given to this event in their official histories, which would have us believe that the declaration of war was not made until after Hannibal crossed the Ebro River in Spain. But this would mean that the declaration of war was not made until well into 218 BC, by which time we also know that the Romans had already mobilized their legions. It seems more likely that the embassy to Carthage complained about the treatment of their allies in Saguntum, but again, this was likely an embarrassing matter to Rome, so emphasis is instead given to Hannibal's violation of the Ebro Treaty, which is a little amusing, since the Romans could certainly be construed to have violated at least the spirit of that same treaty by allying with Saguntum, a city on the Carthaginian side of the river. Now, Polybius and Livy, both of them pillars of ancient history, disagree on a number of other matters surrounding the initiation of the war. So, as with many histories, both ancient and modern, there's plenty of disagreement and outright ignorance about certain events and their timeline. But what we do know is that there is a famous depiction of the official declaration of war. The Romans sent an embassy to Carthage, and this would have happened sometime in either late 219 or 218 BC. The ambassador presented the complaint about Hannibal's activities to the Shofetes in the Council of Carthage. The exact identity of this Roman ambassador is unclear. Polybius does not name him. Some indicate that he was M. Fabius Buteo, leader of the party in opposition to the consuls of that year, Tiberius Sempronius Longus and Publius Cornelius Scipio. You should hear those names. We're going to hear them again. But the ambassador, whoever he was, protested the recent actions of the Carthaginians and made demands that the Roman Senate must certainly have known would be rejected. The Romans wanted Hannibal and his chief advisors to be surrendered to them for punishment. If Carthage refused to do this, it would be choosing war with the Roman Republic. The chief Roman ambassador told the Carthaginians that he had these two options for them caught up in the folds of his toga, which he lifted in his hands before them. One option was for peace, he gestured, the other for war. What would they prefer that he let fall from his toga? The spokesman for the Council of Carthage replied that the Roman should let fall whatever he wanted from his toga. When he replied to them that it would be war, the council shouted back, "We accept it." And so, the greatest war to date in the West was officially underway. Unofficially, for sure, by then things had already been underway for a while. As was customary, there were 4 new legions prepared that spring of 218 BC. The Romans had already planned out an expeditionary venture into Spain with 2 of these legions to take the war directly to Hannibal. As for Hannibal, he had regrouped in Carthago Nova, that's New Carthage, the capital in Spain, over the winter. He now set out from there with something like 90,000 infantry, maybe 12,000 cavalry, and 40 elephants. These men were mostly mercenaries, mostly experienced soldiers from either the Iberian Peninsula or from one of the many tribes in northern Africa over whom the Carthaginians ruled. Hannibal, like Alexander a little over a century before, also brought with him an entourage that included official historians to chronicle his endeavors. He quickly crossed the Ebro and began to subdue the Celtic Iberian tribes that lived there. Speed was his weapon now. He expected the Romans, based on their past performance, not to waste any time, but to bring the war to Spain. He needed to be ready to meet 1, maybe 2 consular armies somewhere in Catalonia, that's in northeast Spain. There he could defeat them and then march on to invade a startled Italy. There he would rally the Gauls and encourage insurrection among Rome's Italian allies. Hannibal had left sufficient forces behind him, just sufficient enough to keep their own allies and subjects in check. These forces were commanded by his brother Hasdrubal in Carthago Nova. If everything went according to plan, Hasdrubal would be able to lead reinforcements into Italy the following year, just adding fuel to the fire with which he planned to burn Rome down. It was a great plan, but there is a saying about plans. It starts with a question. How do you make God laugh? Answer, you tell him your 5-year plan. The spirit of Hannibal's own intentions to raise the Gauls into renewed war with Rome actually foiled his strategy. As he was setting up in northeast Spain to receive the Romans, the Gauls in northern Italy rose up on their own. This distracted the Romans from their plan to invade Spain, as they now had to divert their legions to fighting closer to home. If Hannibal waited any longer, the Romans would have all of northern Italy locked down by the time he arrived, and his opportunity to stoke rebellions in the Roman provinces would have passed. So now Hannibal made the decision for lightning war, for a blitzkrieg over the Pyrenees, across southern France and into northern Italy, hoping to arrive in time before the Romans had completely subdued the Gauls and there were still some embers of anti-Roman aggression to stoke back into a fire. But his brother Hasdrubal did not have enough men to hold down all of Carthage's Spanish dominions and fight off a Roman invasion that was still possible in the near future. So Hannibal had to split off men from his own massive army to leave behind for security. And anyway, the army he had amassed to wait for the Romans was not the kind of army that he needed to march that quickly toward Rome. Furthermore, not all the mercenaries had envisioned leaving the peninsula for their term of service. The plan, after all, had been to fight the Romans here, in Catalonia. So it was then that Hannibal resumed his march, probably sometime in September of 218 BC. He took with him just 50,000 infantry and less than 10,000 cavalry, as well as the elephants. The army climbed into the Pyrenees toward the south of France, where they would probably have to fight all those tribes that failed to see Hannibal as a liberator, and then he still had to reach northern Italy. Now, we have talked before about the differing intentions of the combatants in this war. How many in the establishment on both sides probably envisioned a colonial war, a war for expanded frontiers, a war to end in another treaty with advantages and disadvantages and pros and cons for both sides. Hannibal, though, had always envisioned a crusade and a crushing victory that would bring Rome into humiliating submission. Probably, though, Hannibal never imagined that he would spend over a decade in Italy, roaming around, running from battle to battle, besieging Roman cities and trying desperately to coax Roman allies and tributaries into betraying their masters. Unsupported by his rulers back home in Carthage, and only to be called back at the end of the conflict to try to save his beleaguered fatherland. But that was all yet to come. At the moment, Hannibal and his army were headed first north and then east, into the rising sun, and toward a future in which only war was certain. Until the next episode, I thank you for listening to the Western Traditions Podcast.